By 6 p.m. on October the 4th, day one of the nationwide invasion, combat in the city of Beaumont had effectively come to a close as literally 15 minutes prior at 5:45 p.m. in the evening, the Heavy Combined Arms Battalion, as well as also the Combat Engineer Battalion, had wrapped up major operations within the city itself to secure I-10, as they had already taken many of the city's critically important additional objectives, including its military facilities, port facilities, and local industrial and energy facilities as well. As the external invasion prong, acting in accordance with their fourth-generation warfare doctrines, were now moving through the battle space by 6 p.m. up I-10 to pass through the recently captured and cleared critical node of the city of Beaumont en route to the American southeastern invasion sector from the south-central invasion sector, as the Beaumont-Port Arthur battle space was part of the south-central invasion sector but served as the gateway to the American southeast. These PLA group armies and their many miles-long convoy would continue moving along I-10 until they had reached the Sabine River Bridge in the city of Orange, the literal and figurative gateway to the American Southeast, upon which they would continue on into the American Southeast to bolster the local Trojan shock forces in that particular invasion sector. Between this time, as the heavy combat having had occurred earlier in the city carried out by both the Heavy Combined Arms Battalion as well as the Combat Engineer Battalion, had seen these two battalions essentially liquidating all resistance in the area within the city of Beaumont, and now were aggressively patrolling the area as the PLA group armies were passing through along I-10, as the entire route had to remain secured until these group armies had essentially vacated the area, as they had been passing through. This would last again until 9 p.m. as they entered at 6 p.m. And after this point in time, all of the comprising battalions of the overall 6th PLAN Marine Brigade would conduct a lengthy logistical resupply period, as well as also a heavy-duty maintenance operation on all of their equipment, and a short respite period for the troops involved in heavy combat on the first day. However, even in spite of these actions, the leadership echelon of the 6th PLAN Marine Brigade were also planning their next operations. As on the first day of the invasion, despite the fact that the vast majority of coalition resources in this battle space were deployed against the most important objectives, which had to be taken on the first day, the massive ISR apparatus of the coalition, from its lower-level quadcopter assets at the literal squad and vehicle crew level in every unit, to the high-altitude recon drones and other assets, as well as also the satellite-based assets over them, all interlocked to map the entirety of the battle space in real time. As China was the world's largest drone-producing nation by a gargantuan gulf, they had deployed tens of thousands of high-altitude recon drones into the area, some more advanced than were others. And as high-altitude drones such as the WZ-8 had ground-penetrating radar capabilities, the WZ-7s employed in this battle space did not, nor did the armed high-altitude recon CH-4As, as these high-altitude recon drones had been deployed to cover that layer of ISR over this battle space. As the Operations on the first day had been going on to capture and control I-10 and all of the key objectives within Beaumont and in the surrounding area, including Vidor and the city of Orange, as well as also the Entergy Sabine power plant. Another critically important objective. The next phase of operations now being planned within the headquarters of Headquarters Company over the entire 6th PLAN Marine Brigade would see the leadership planning to proceed with a major air assault operation to clear the northern hinterlands of this primary battle space, being the Port Arthur/Beaumont battle space. As on early day one, 50 U.S. Marine Corps survivors from both the Alpha Company and Weapons Company, respectively, as the 50 came from the two companies belonging to the larger 1st of the 123rd Marine Battalion being deployed at this bivouac site just north and outside of Beaumont, the 50 survivors had managed to take a small number of their heavy weapons with them before the gargantuan Su-34 airstrikes, as well as the sea-based cruise missile strikes and the air assault attack from both the Z-9WA attack helo gunships and the 82mm mortar company had completely and thoroughly destroyed their bivouac site. There was even a platoon from one of the two deployed air assault marine infantry companies had also assisted in this endeavor with the massively enormous firepower deployed to support them in this operation. As the bivouac site had been completely and totally smashed, again, mostly by the Su-34 airstrikes, but the mopping up done by the gunships, the mortar assault, and the small number of ground troops, the 50 surviving U.S. Marines had fled into the northwest of the battle space into the swampy and wooded hinterlands that were just to the northwest of the city of Beaumont on day one, and early on day one at that. They also had linked up with local militia forces who were from the local area, and like all of the other militias around the country, and including within this entire battle space, came from all walks of life and all professions. There were even some land surveyors who worked for TxDOT, as well as road crew workers, who could now redeploy these particular skills in order to assist in defensive preparations. As the road workers, as they could be highly effective in digging operations, as well as also the land surveyors picking the proper places to prepare these Viet Cong-style defensive belts. These forces would prepare 3 different defensive areas comprising a larger base camp out in the swamps and woods in this particular area, as they had fled into these wilderness areas at the first sign of trouble, as explosions were heard effectively several miles away when the massive airstrikes had come in and hit the Marines' bivouac site, as well as the cruise missile strikes all throughout the area, hitting many of the bridges, minus a select few that were strategically important and viable for use by the 6th PLAN Marine Brigade. As this group had come together, the Marines and militia leadership worked together to devise plans to establish solid defenses, which would include tunnel networks linking fighting positions such as foxholes and a small number of underground bunkers, which be dug a bit deeper. As in any situation, when you have hundreds of people digging, you can rapidly create defensive positions in relatively short time, although not elaborate defensive positions like many of the Viet Congs in the Vietnam War were. They were still somewhat effective and well prepared for the amount of time available to these forces and the equipment they were working with. As there were just slightly over 500 in this particular militia, similar to the size of the militia that came from just outside of Beaumont city limits to the west, this group, combined with the 50 U.S. Marine survivors, would end up giving the 6th PLAN Marine Brigade's air assault forces a run for their money, as the saying could be said, as the PLAN Marines of the 6th Brigade would suffer their largest single casualty count in this one search and destroy operation, as up until this point, casualties in most instances within the 6th PLAN Marine Brigade had been relatively light, going from all of the different operations that had already unfolded. However, this operation would be the single most devastating operation in terms of casualties for the PLAN Marines, as the Air Assault Battalion of the 6th PLAN Marine Brigade would deploy 2 of its 4 Air Assault Marine Infantry companies, which would be flown into the battle by their Transport Aviation Company with their high-capacity Z-18 utility helicopters, as each flying platoon of 5 Z-18s could carry an entire company of these troops into battle, and there were 3 flying platoons. The 3rd flying platoon would act effectively as a logistical flying platoon and medevac platoon, while the other 2 flying platoons would shuttle the troops into battle into this textbook search and destroy operation, as the plan would be to insert these troops in nearby wheat fields near the base camp and have them sweep the area for enemies and destroy them, and then withdraw to conduct further air assault search and destroy missions in the northern portion of the battle space, as the firepower available to support these operations would be simply massive, as not only would the Air Assault Battalion have its own attack helo gunships available, as the 2 flying platoons of the Z-9WAs would give enormous aviation-based fire support. They would also have their 82 millimeter mortar support, as the mortar company, having had been dropped off in the north early on day 1 with 2 of the 4 Air Assault Marine Infantry companies, the mortar company would remain in its current positions along with 1 of 2 deployed Air Assault Marine Infantry companies, while the other one of the 2 would be taken along with 1 of the 2 that had been guarding the I-10 bridge in the southwest of the city of Beaumont, and both companies would be flown into this search and destroy operation, with the mortar company able to reach the battle space with their extended range mortar ammunition, which was just within range to hit this area. Therefore, essentially negating the requirement to bring them to a different firing location. As for the artillery battalion of the 6th PLAN Marine Brigade, with their PLZ-07 122mm howitzers, having had moved the entire battalion to a new firing point along this canal, they were in the perfect position to strategically support the entire brigade's operations in many of the key nodes in this particular area. And with their rocket-assisted projectiles, which effectively were their extended range munitions, these rocket-assisted projectiles were just barely within range to hit the southern positions of this particular operation. And because the battalion would be needed to assist if any flashpoints erupted in the battle space elsewhere, they would not move any of their firing batteries further up to be able to extend the range, and would remain positioned where they were, as the gunship support, the 82mm mortar support, and the gargantuan air power of coalition forces in this particular battle space, with 2 J-10 squadrons equipped with predominantly air-to-ground munitions, and of course the single Su-34 strike aircraft squadron of the Russian VVS, or their Air Force, would be more than enough to make up for any shortfalls in artillery being able to reach the entirety of the operations battle space, as also there would be sea-based cruise missile strikes that would be authorized to assist in this operation, as by this point in time, as early on day 2 at 4 a.m. when this operation was slated to begin, there were many cruise missile strikes that were occurring in other areas, including in Houston at this time, to suppress partisan uprisings in the hinterlands outside of Houston. And there would be some cruise missile strikes that would effectively be diverted to assist in this operation in the same manner as well, as 2 YJ-18B cruise missiles would be launched from one of the 4 Yuan-class submarines off the coast. As there were also the Renhai-class guided missile cruisers, they would not be partaking in this particular operation, but would be assisting in other operations along the coastal areas of Texas. As the Air Assault Battalion prepared its forces aboard their Type 75 helicopter landing dock, which was outside of the Sabine Lake, which technically wasn't a lake at all, but was part of the ocean, but an inlet. Outside of the Sabine Lake, just off the coast, was where the Type 75 helicopter landing dock remained in position, and the Combat Aviation Company within the Air Assault Battalion would fly its 2 flying platoons, as it also had its headquarters and support platoon of the company and a maintenance platoon that remained aboard the vessel, the Type 75 helicopter landing dock, with the 3 flying platoons of the Z-18s of the Transport Aviation Company following right behind them as they flew together, essentially to pick up the 2 chosen companies of Air Assault Marine Infantry to deploy them in this operation by 4 a.m. As the battle was set to begin, as, again, maintenance activities had been occurring between the time hostilities had ended in the key node of Beaumont and as the externals had moved through the area until the beginning of this operation, which was set to begin at 4 a.m. As an hour prior, the preparations for the Air Assault Battalion were complete in terms of maintenance and preparing the logistical assets, as a copious amount of ammunition would be delivered by one of the 3 flying platoons, along with medical supplies, medics aboard for medevac purposes, as well as also MREs and water. As the operation would be a 3-hour-long operation taking place in a somewhat sizable area, effectively an area that was, if we go to the map, a 2-mile east to west by 1.5-mile north to south area. And to shape the battlefield to prepare for this operation, a sizable airstrike would occur on the grouping of tunnels and fighting positions that were located to the southwest and off of this map and slight on it, and another grouping that was just to the north and off of this map, as the battlefield had to be prepared to allow for the gunships to get in closer to the main base camp to assist in its destruction. As the base camp itself, as the Marines had advised heavily on its construction, along with the militiamen that were professionals, such as the land surveyors and road crew workers and others, the position was planned to have mutually supporting fields of fire and tunnels within which that personnel could shield themselves from certain munitions. As the munitions aboard the attack helo gunships, everything from the HJO-8 ATGMs to some that were equipped with rocket pods in their stead, such as the 70mm rocket pods and the 23mm cannon on either side of these gunships. These tunnels could effectively protect the militia and marine personnel underground from these types of munitions and weapon systems, as well as also 82mm mortar strikes and the CH-901A loitering munition strikes. However, direct artillery strikes on tunnels themselves would result in the tunnel's collapse and destruction. However, it would take a few shells in the same location to cause this. However, this entire base camp was completely and totally vulnerable to any type of airstrikes from fixed-wing aircraft, as a single 1,000-pound munition would be more than enough to completely wipe out a large section of tunnel, as these munitions were absolutely devastating aboard both the PLAAF's J-10 fighter aircraft as well as also the Russian Su-34 strike aircraft of their VVS, as the J-10 squadrons essentially would, as one of their 2 squadrons, would send in 8 of their 12 aircraft on this sortie. they would strike with 4 aircraft each the area to the southwest of the main base camp with its smaller number of tunnels and fighting positions, and another 4 to hit the area just to the north and off map to help shape the battlefield to prevent any type of ground-based fire from effectively hitting these gunships from behind as they moved in closer to hit the main base camp. As they shaped and prepared the battlefield in this way just before the operation was set to occur, throughout the course of the operation, artillery and cruise missile strikes, 2 cruise missile strikes that were fired by the One-class subs, later to be followed up by an Su-34 strike of 4 Su-34 strike aircraft in the area, would see the destruction almost entirely of the base camp as a whole, as it was being swept and cleaned out by the ground forces, as boots on the ground were a requirement in order to ensure that these areas were completely swept clean of partisans, insurgents, or freedom fighters, as the Americans called themselves in that manner. As the PLAN Marines would be landed into the area by their Z-18 utility helicopters of their Transport Aviation Company, they would conduct a gradual sweep towards the known base camp, as the base camp effectively sat also by a rice farm, and heavy combat would actually ensue in the rice paddies on the rice farm in the nearby wooded areas. As the first day had seen the ISR assets essentially monitoring the entire area, even as the heavy fighting was occurring to seize the most important objectives of day one, the entire battle space was being monitored in real time by the massive ISR apparatus and satellite and even quadcopter assets of the air assault troops in this area, who ran circuits around their positions. Some of the quadcopters were able to see portions of this area as they didn't go too far and into the base camp area. It was enough to get a general idea of where the LZ effectively should be chosen for this operation, which essentially would be 2 wheat farms in the area, with their wheat fields being the most sizable areas within which to effectively land their ground troops of the 6 PLAN Marine Brigades, Air Assault Battalions, 2 chosen Air Assault Marine Infantry companies. As the Americans had ostensibly been seen digging and moving around throughout the area in a sort of working type of manner, as they were clearing certain areas and also completely digging up copious amounts of soil, the massive tree cover and underground foliage and tall grasses and more had helped, along with the constant stream of refugees moving through the area and setting up tents in the area, which would ultimately be their undoing, as the crossfire of this upcoming operation would completely wipe out thousands of them in this immediate area, had helped to somewhat obscure the preparations that were going on. And as the high altitude recon drones and satellite assets above those were those that had mostly been observing the goings-on, again with the exception of the quadcopters getting somewhat near the area. The obscuring of the operations to dig up these areas was enough to help with the planting of certain munitions that the Americans possessed, as the U.S. Marines, the survivors, had managed to flee the area with a total of 4 M250 cals, including with their tripods, and a relatively sizable number of rounds for these weapons, as well as also 2 Javelin ATGMs, which would be put to excellent use against the 6 PLAN Marine Brigade's air assault troops of their air assault battalion in this operation, as well as also a single crate of claymore mines that would be command detonated with the det cords. Effectively, 6 claymore mines came in a crate of claymore mines, and these mines would be utilized in a manner to where they would guard two entryways into the tunnel network, as this tunnel network was guarded by two, this tunnel network guarded by two, and the last two of the six would be planted in a very tactical position in a choke point between the two rice paddies on the rice farm, as some of the militiamen would try to disguise themselves in these rice paddies, even some taking steps to effectively go under the muddy waters with snorkels as long as possible, having their weapons effectively being camouflaged by grasses and other vegetation for when the Marines arrived, as they would hear the helicopters coming into the area. Others would take positions in the woods, while others yet still would maintain their positions within the somewhat relative safety of the sizable foxholes that were connected by tunnels and enabled them to effectively duck out and into the tunnel system when these areas were being hit by various munitions as the battle would draw on. Although at the time of the assault, there would be many militiamen that were effectively doing patrols in the surrounded wooded areas, and although they had set their munitions well, including improvised explosive devices, as one was guarding another tunnel entrance, an improvised device, as they effectively only possessed one, as they only managed to build one, and it was a crude one, effectively a pipe-based munition. The forces being caught unawares, as the shock and awe of this attack would come very suddenly, as the air assault battalion was a highly rapidly deployable force. The gunships, flying in an inverted wedge, would come into the area in their inverted wedge and begin attacking in an L vector of fire to sweep the area ahead of the LZ, to clear the LZ for the landings of their infantry, Marines of the air assault infantry, who would then aid in sweeping the surrounding areas of all enemy personnel, as the operation would unfold in phases, as these gunships were able to carry copious amounts of 23 millimeter ammunition, especially when combining all 10 of them. And the quantities of rockets were sizable, as between both rocket pods on either side of those carrying 70 millimeter rocket pods, they could carry a total of 38 of these devastating 70 millimeter rockets on each gunship, while others were equipped with the HJ-08 ATGM pods, as they could carry 8 of these apiece, which were even more powerful than the 70 millimeter rockets, but of course there was less of them. The 23 millimeter cannon fire would effectively be the most consistent of the weapons aboard these aircraft, as again they could carry a sizable number of rounds for these cannons and would be directed in their fires by the real-time AI battlefield data processing system through the ISR apparatus as the troops would advance on the ground, as they would play with the Combat Aviation Company a key critical role in clearing the areas around the LZ of enemy personnel to enable the troops to land and then conduct their ground-based portion of the operation. As the militiamen, again, were scattered throughout the area, especially after the heavy airstrikes that had occurred just before the start of this operation, as again, a total of 8 J-10s out of one of the 2 J-10 squadrons, as in 8 out of 12 aircraft of one squadron, had essentially carried out their sizable strike operation, wherein the total of 8 J-10s dropped their complete payload aboard of 12,000 pounds of air-to-ground munitions, as 4 J-10s struck in the southwest, the other 4 struck in the north, just off this map, hitting the other tunnel and bunker complex and foxhole complex, leaving the main base camp to essentially be mopped up by the combination of the ground troops along with their support assets in the form of the Combat Aviation Company with their Z9WA Tachyla gunships, as well as also the Mortar Company with their 82mm mortars, supported to the hilt by the Su-34 strike aircraft, which would conduct their own strikes on the main base camp a bit further into the operation, as artillery would also open up on targets that they were just within range to hit with their rocket-assisted projectiles, as the real-time AI battlefield data processing system would also, too, send them pre-prepared strike packages down to their FDC sections in each firing platoon of each firing battery. These howitzer batteries would lay down immense 122mm shell fire on targets they were able to reach, as well as the PLAN Marines would advance through the area and into the woodlands and swamps near the base camp. The fighting would be heavy in this operation, as the operation was now kicking off at 4 a.m. The gunships had already, before this map even opens up, wiped out personnel both on the local roads and patrolling this wheat farm between this wooded area and the fence along this wheat farm, as this grouping of militiamen were on a patrol in a single column formation. They had been wiped out by 23mm cannon fire as these gunships flew in hot, firing their weapons at pre-prepared targets that had been picked out by the orbiting WZ-7 high-altitude recon drone and satellite imagery in the area. And with the landing of the two companies, each squad would deploy their quadcopter assets to run circuits throughout the entire area to map everything out in far more detail than even the high altitude and satellite were capable of. And as these gunships lit up these ATVs with 2 personnel on each one, these were destroyed in the earlier airstrikes before the operation had kicked off. A total of just over 200 militiamen between both areas were completely and thoroughly wiped out, leaving only approximately 300 left, plus the 50 U.S. Marines in the area, as the operation now had begun in earnest. These personnel, this was FM 421 and this was 326 when we're to look at a map. There are also lanes that came off of this road here and led to the driveways of this ranch, as this was the ranch area with the barns, feed silos. This was the ranch house of the ranch, a large country home with a metal building out back, within which the tunnel system, in yellow here, as it's color-coded in yellow, comes up in the backyard of this ranch and was highly camouflaged by the garden with trees and undergrowth and bushes and more and shrubs. It was highly disguised and was chosen for the entry point out of the tunnel system towards this direction in this area, while in the south, similar was the case with the tunnel system here, as this tunnel system came out into the backyard of this country home, as there were 2 rural homes here, just standard country homes. They came off of this lane as their driveways led to their garages here, and then this driveway went all the way to the garage of the rice farm, the farmer's home of the rice farm. They also had a metal building for excess equipment and a barn within which they had tractors and other sizable pieces of equipment stored for their rice farming operation. These were thickly wooded areas on their property. This was the fence line and back gate into and out of the rice farm property, fencing that went all the way around here. This was very swampy and marshy land, but again, lay the importance of the land surveyors who assisted in aiding in providing information on the best possible sites to dig at amid all of this marshy, swampy, and thickly wooded terrain, as there were some marshlands out here, but then the rest of it was swamp as it was thickly wooded, and then there were just plain woodlands in other areas, and the rice farm here, and the entry point here and here, this one protected by the pipe-based improvised device, this one protected by 2 claymore mines, which were command det. There were 2 Marines in this tunnel that would operate the command det claymores, and up here were the other 2 commandet claymores, and there was 2 Marines that would operate these. And also, again, there were 4 M250 cals spread throughout the area, and they were placed in the best possible positions as per the defensive needs of this combined group of Marines and militiamen. One was placed in this foxhole, another in this foxhole, and there was another in this foxhole, and another in this foxhole here. The way these foxholes and tunnels were dug was to provide areas where there could be kill zones created by the interlocking fields of fire, as all of these foxholes could have interlocking fields of fire. It was done extremely well, very tactically astute in how they established these foxholes to all work together and create these kill boxes, and it was in fact intended to turn the rice farm, the rice paddies, into a kill box of sorts as well, including complete with the commandet claymore mines, which would be operated by these 2 Marines. By this point in time, as there were only 50 U.S. Marine survivors, they were not operating in squads in the formal sense, but had broken down into much smaller groups, and were all trying to work together with the militiamen to essentially create their own insurgent or partisan operation or group. And in this particular area, as they had also managed to escape with 2 of their Javelin ATGMs, although these were not proper air defense systems and instead were systems designed with attacking tanks and vehicles and other ground targets in mind, these systems could, however, be utilized against very low and very slow flying helicopters or hovering helicopters that were also relatively low. And these would be used to this effect in this operation against the 6th PLAN Marine Brigade, as the 6th PLAN Marine Brigade would lose one of their Z-18 utility helicopters from one of their flying platoons, along with 2 out of 3 squads on board. The reason being is because in this particular wheat field, the wheat field could only accommodate the landing of 4 of these Z-18 utility helos, while the 5th had to hover due to the nearby metal building and the wood line back in this area here on the border of the wheat field. Therefore, they would fast rope their squads out of these helos and would only manage to get one of the 3 out safely before the helo would be knocked out of the sky by 2 well-aimed, well-fired Javelin ATGMs, as the U.S. Marines would effectively sneak out of their camouflage tunnel, and these were the same 2 that operated the claymores. They would hurriedly run to this metal portable building and come around and quickly take aim, lock on, and fire their ATGMs over this barn as this helo was hovering just over the barn roof level and could be hit by these ATGMs, and it would fall and crash with its rotor blades flying off, mostly back in these directions into the woods. And 2 squads would be completely wiped out in one fell swoop, along with the pilot and co-pilot of the helo, of the transport helo. As the troops were landed, their helos quickly departed after they had dropped off the entire company, 1 company in the south and 1 company in the north. Out of these companies and their 3 platoons, 1 platoon would stay back to guard the LZ, as they would have to effectively depart from this area after the operation had ended, while the 2 other platoons, as 1 platoon guarded the LZ, the 2 other platoons would effectively carry out the operation in terms of the offensive portion of it. As in the south, the Southern Company, 1 platoon would guard the LZ for the logistical flights from the 3rd Flying Platoon, as these 2 flying platoons would leave the area, of course losing a helicopter early on. The 3rd Flying Platoon would fly in and drop off, again, copious amounts of ammunition and supplies required at least to carry out this particular operation. as they too would then leave, but would return for medevac flights, both from this position, but also from this position by this intersection where there was just enough room for one helicopter to land, drop off combat medics, and pull out KIAs and severely WIAs from a savage Claymore mine attack by this entry point to the tunnel and foxhole fighting position system in the area. As the gunships came in hot and wiped out with 23 millimeter fire these ATVs, these personnel patrolling the edge of this wheat field. They also wiped out these 3 ATVs coming down the road, as well as also these personnel both in this drainage system, which acted as a makeshift trench, and in this wood line. They also wiped out this group here near these feed silos and between these barns on the ranch. They wiped out this group. And of course, the other groups that were wiped out by these gunships were this group here. There was also this group here with 2 ATVs, this group here, and this group up here and here as well, and also this group here. All of this happened as these gunships came in, firing their 23 millimeter cannon fire as the operation had kicked off. Much of the fighting here occurred within the first hour as these gunships bobbed and weaved in this area and continued to lay down fire as they had wiped these personnel out all within the first 20 minutes, followed up by now reshifting their fire against other groups, including against foxhole positions themselves, such as in this animation or illustration, where 70 millimeter rockets are flying in and blowing trees into pieces or throwing them in different directions, throwing up soil and shrapnel, and wiping out personnel. These rockets are even about to fly in here and wipe some of these personnel out as well, as the personnel could disappear in the event of heavy bombardment into the tunnels on either side of their foxholes. They could reemerge and repopulate these fighting positions and continue to lay down pressure against the attackers, as they would use similar tactics to the Viet Cong throughout this particular engagement. Again, this would be the one engagement in the entire Beaumont/Port Arthur campaign within which the PLAN would suffer their heaviest casualties in a single engagement, and it would remain so until the end of this 2-day-long battle within the scope of the 4-day-long invasion as a whole, as the nation would be invaded and conquered in 4 days, although within the first 2 days, the vast majority of areas throughout the country would be brought completely under coalition control, and Beaumont was included in this. However, again, after the 4-day invasion phase, little by little, insurgent/partisan groups or resistance forces, however one would want to call it, would continue to rise up throughout the nation, although suffering a monstrosity in terms of casualties and a steep learning curve. These forces would only get better and better as time would go on, as they would get better equipment, they would get more and more experience, and they would start to train personnel little by little over time and begin to have massive recruitment efforts, as the bleak options for the American population would push many of them into fighting back against the occupation forces. However, they were up against an enemy with gargantuan firepower and technology dominance as it related to the coalition, and also they were fighting an enemy that was much better trained and led than they were as well. And this battle would see much of the American population being gradually ground down over time, with considerably far less losses among the coalition. However, the losses over time of the Chinese and some of their coalition partners who opted to remain with them to occupy China's new colony with them would see the populations back home in these countries beginning to ask questions at first, and then later on beginning to demand an end to hostilities. Very similar to what any major power experiences any time they go into a war of occupation and a war of insurgency as it pertains to the side of the partisans or the resistance forces. As the PLAN Marines, now freshly landed, began to advance through the area, as each squad level NCO with their tablet level combat data link / quadcopter operational panel, or operating their squad level quadcopter assets in each squad. They all link together to be the eyes and ears of the real-time AI battlefield data processing system, along with the high-altitude assets, such as this WZ-7, which happened at this time to be orbiting over this battle space at this time, which is why it's on the map, and the satellite assets to interlock to map the ever-fluid, changing modern battlefield in real time. As 2 squads have been lost from this Z-18 utility helicopter from this flying platoon delivering the company in the north, this platoon had now 4 total squads. However, they were still combat effective with 4 squads and would now clear these buildings as they had already cleared these 2 buildings. These squads would now bound and cover tactically this squad between this clump of trees and the home here of this wheat farm. This squad would bound at first to watch the road, and then would bound over here to assist this squad and this squad in laying down suppressing fire on the 30 militiamen occupying this home. As they were hidden in the home at the beginning of the operation, this gunship had completely flown over them, firing at these forces here and here and here, along with this gunship, and had completely missed the personnel in this home. However, pot shots have been taken out of the windows, causing this gunship to fly around and pound the home with 23mm cannon fire as it hovered at treetop level above these trees, blasting out much of the back of this large home and wiping out most of the defenders inside. However, some continue to offer very limited resistance out of the windows of this home, which caused promptly suppressing fire to be laid down at them as the squad gradually bounded forward, breached the home, and effectively had begun to clear it of enemy personnel as the squad broke into 2 stack teams and checked both floors of the home at the same time, moving through it in stack team formations before they would reform and proceed out of the back door of the home to essentially sweep this big metal shed and check if for anyone, and it was unoccupied at the time. And as this squad had moved up along with them, according to building clearance procedures, to cut off escapes or to be possible reinforcements if called in by the squad, if there was too many personnel or it was too hot in there for one squad, they could call on the other squad as reinforcements. However, they bounded up alongside this shed and would hold their positions to watch this general direction, this flank of the operation, while this squad would hold positions in the building and watch this direction, while this squad would watch the road with this squad, and they would generally sit in these positions for the rest of the operation, while the gunship had then moved to this position to begin continually supporting the operation, pounding this group with 23mm fire, wiping out 5 personnel in this group, while the rest continued on as the arrow indicates, but is covered in red completely, which means they're completely wiped out as the ISR and AI battlefield data processing system mortar strikes of 82mm mortars from the 82mm mortar company pounded this grouping in this thickly wooded area, as well as ATGM fires from the gunship as 2 HJ-08 ATGMs pounded this group, along with some 23mm fire directed at them as well, and mortar strikes. And additional HJ-08s were fired to hit this group with 23mm fire into them as well. As they got over top of the tunnel system, they were destroyed by the ATGMs and 23mm fire, with the HE armor-piercing ammunition shredding through their ranks, tearing them to human meat, effectively. As they were completely blown away, very literally, they now would see throughout this battle space more of their number being dealt with in the same manner, as these gunships here and here were laying down rocket fires into this group here, as they actually had 2 technicals in the backyard of this country home, just on the side of the metal shed here. There were also personnel that were frantically moving through the area as these gunships had come in with weapons blazing, blowing personnel away. These personnel had taken the cue by this wood line here and tried to flee into the thickly wooded terrain, only to be heavily rocketed by this gunship with 23mm fire, as well as the gunship veered back and forth with their fire. They showered this area in 70mm rockets and 23mm cannon fire, wiping out these personnel, including those of this group here that had fled into this wooded terrain. This gunship, meanwhile, had destroyed this improvised device as it was not very well disguised, and it was seen with the quadcopter assets, and fire had been directed on it with 23 millimeter fire, and this pipe device blew up almost instantaneously, so it was not a factor along this lane. The gunships also fired into the drainage trench or drainage ditch here, which is being used as a makeshift trench line by the partisans along the roadside here. And they were being hit by 23 millimeter cannon fire from the gunships, as well as also fire from the bounding, advancing platoons of PLAN Marines, now moving gradually towards the drainage system as they would cross the road and bound into the same positions once held by the militiamen in this particular area. As the fighting was heavy in this particular sector already, and 7 personnel in this position had tried to flee, they were cut down in the rocket strikes and 23 millimeter fire, along with some ground-based fire being exchanged briefly before these personnel had been annihilated by the fires from both the ground troops and the gunships from 23 millimeter cannon fire raking up and down in this position. As these troops were being engaged, they laid down heavy return fire with everything from their light machine guns, their QBJ-201s, which had a highly excessive rate of fire, a rapid rate of fire, as well as their standard rifles, QBZ-95s, and of course their light anti-armor / anti-personnel weaponry in the form of their Type 69 RPGs, in this case equipped with anti-personnel rockets, which were fragmentation rockets, which were devastating against dismounted personnel, and also others using 35 millimeter tube-fired grenades. Tripod-based crew serves would even be deployed by these air assault marine infantry troops of the PLAN, as they would bring in QLZ-04 belt-fed 35 millimeter grenade launching systems, which effectively were like a belt-fed grenade machine gun firing repeated 35 millimeter grenades. In this animation or illustration, they're firing it over this line of troops here who's laying down suppressing fire so this other squad can advance in a bounding and covering sort of scenario in this particular animation or illustration. In the background are friendly PLAN troops of another squad moving to check the barns. While this home's completely on fire and partially destroyed, there's destroyed buildings over here that are smoking in the background as a KIA militiaman lays on this mound in this particular animation. These personnel are watching their rear flanks as the rest of the squad moves up and other squads are off. This particular animation or illustration is part of the platoon as a whole, as they're moving through this wooded area with farmlands in the background. While these troops are bounding and covering tactically into position, with this squad, the middle squad, and this squad bounding first, followed by this squad and this squad bounding second, then they bound into the trench systems, and then followed by this squad and this squad last. They now take position in the trench system and continue to lay down fire, as earlier the rocket and 23 millimeter cannon fire had showered this area with rockets and this area with rockets. As this group had tried to come around through the rice farm, briefly pausing here as the operation opened up, they then came around in this area to leave the back gate of the rice farm, as the thickly wooded area here within the fence line and this other wooded area, they were trying to get out and to get to another area to seek shelter. At the time, there were already personnel in this area milling about, and these personnel had tried to flee. They were hit by 70 millimeter rocket fire from this gunship and 23 millimeter fire as they all converged into the same area. The real-time AI battlefield data processing system had strongly advised this gunship to utilize their rockets in this type of position because it was the most advantageous scenario within which to use their rocket pods up, and they used them to great effect, wiping out dozens of personnel that had moved into this area, as there were over 24 personnel that had been wiped out just in this one rocket strike from this one gunship with 23 millimeter fire joining in. As this was happening and this platoon gotten into their positions, this platoon here, including these two squads in the diamond formation as they exited their Z-18, they formed a diamond after the first squad got out. They then moved up ahead as these squads moved first. This squad bounding to this wood line, while this squad bounded to the south of the wood line, and this squad bounded to face this direction. They briefly had exchanged fire with this group in this trench line, although this group ended up being wiped out as they're all surrounded in red by return fire from the ground forces and gunship fire early on. When they were in these positions, these two squads, as they moved up into position, as these squads now made it first, they then would split up with one squad going this way and one squad facing this way, with this squad here, this wedge formation, moving out of the trenches and going over to check this area with the barns. As they were in a wedge, they faced two directions so they could cover this area and this area just in case they were attacked. They then bounded into this barn, cleared it, and then checked this barn, cleared it, and then would come out and hold their position in a wedge facing this general direction here to watch this flank of the operation, while this squad, as these two squads forming this large diamond around the Z-18, as they had moved out of here, they broke into their individual squads, and this squad went here by this tree line in the ranch land, and this squad took position along the fence line gateway that separated the ranch proper from the property, the home, and this large metal shed building. As these Marines had successfully fired the two javelins, which were the only two that they had at that point, as they were the only two they could escape with when they fled their bivouac site, along with a crate of 6 Claymore mines and their 4 M250 cal machine guns, they had fled back into the relative safety of their tunnel entry point, their tunnel compound, and will hold their positions to prepare to set off the claymores if any of these PLAN Marines got close. And every now and then, this grouping of militiamen and these two Marines would exchange fire out of the tunnel system against these squads here, who would return fire back at them, and a lengthy firefight would break out as this squad moved into these 3 personnel that tried to escape had been cut down earlier by gunship and ground-based fire. This squad would clear this farm home on the ranch, and this squad would clear this metal building, but these two squads would hold their positions in these buildings as their platoon had moved into this ranch. And this squad would also lay down fire straight ahead toward the entryway, while this squad and this squad vectored fire from these two different angles at this tunnel entry point. And the squad, now having cleared the house, was firing from the top floor down into this entry point and would gradually wound and sometimes eliminate some of the militiamen, and eventually the Marines and militiamen in this tunnel would run out of ammunition and be forced to surrender by the end of the operation, as they also threw hand grenades toward the tunnel entrance. All of the attacking, of course, again, ISR directed. They had stayed back from the tunnel entrance because earlier in the operation, even before they had cleared these buildings and reached these points, cleared the barn, before this had happened in the north, the platoon moving in the south, as they had cleared this house on the wheat farm after first clearing this shed, had, in 2 squads behind this wedge formation, moved out as a 3-squad-sized element, with the wedge formation squad leading the way of this platoon here, as these squads had each cleared the barns, with this squad having had fired out the side barn door at these militiamen in the trench, with the gunship laying down massive 23mm fire wiping them out, and these 7 trying to get away were cut down by interlocking fields of fire from when the squad was in the barn, and this wedge formation squad, part of their squad, firing in this direction as they faced this direction and this direction to have interlocking fields of fire together, and with these other personnel, such as the squad that took position in the barn. They came around and were laying down fire against this house, as they had taken fire from this house, as there were 5 personnel inside, but when the rockets had struck, 70mm rockets had hit the side of the home, partially gutting the side of the house and the garage, wiping out 2 of the 5 personnel, leaving 3, but they still managed to fire at these personnel as they came around. This squad of the platoon came here, and then the squads bounded and covered tactically, ending up with 2 taking positions in the drainage ditch, laying down fire at the three that were still in this house, while this squad, stopping short of the road, laid down in the prone position by the road and effectively were firing over the road, which was 326 north-south, and they were firing over 326 at that point in time at this house and this house, giving covering fire while these personnel were firing at it as well. And as 5 personnel had tried to flee when this drainage system here was rocketed heavily by the attack helo gunships, as well as 23 millimeter fire from this gunship, many of these personnel were wiped out, including 5 that tried to just get out of the trench and couldn't get out on time and were cut down by the rockets and 23 millimeter fire. Only 8 managed to escape into this tunnel system, with all the rest being wiped out by the rocket strikes from 70 millimeter rocket fire and 23 millimeter fire and ground-based fire, as these troops had reached this point here and were firing at them as well as they tried to. As 8 made it out and 5 tried to get out, they were cut down, as well as fire being directed at the house, leading to these 3 squads, the wedge and the 2 single column formation squads, breaking into their 3 squad formations and bounding and covering into these positions, where the middle squad, again, was along the road here, taking position in the prone along the road, while the other 4 squads took cover in the drainage system along the road, such as 2 here and 2 here, as they would prepare to clear these buildings. As all of this action was underway in this particular area, the gunships were laying down heavy fire in support of the ground operations here, as the troops were gradually beginning to clear the buildings in the area, trying to wrest control of them from the local militia forces. In the thickly wooded and swampy areas in the general north of the map, these gunships between 4 a.m. and 5 had already wiped out sizable clusters of personnel, including with their ATVs. Even the GJ-11 stealth strike drone, which could carry 4 1,000-pound precision-guided munitions, which was an incredible payload capacity for a drone, was able to come in and pound individuals that were spread out throughout this swampy area, including these ATVs, which each carried 2 personnel, and wiped out this squad-sized group and these 4 personnel, and the 2 on this ATV and the 2 on this ATV, wiping them out with 4 of their precision-guided munitions, as the other GJ-11 was being effectively saved for the next operation of this type, as again, there would be a further air assault operation against another militia group that was to occur in the mid-afternoon, as this was, again, pre-dawn, as a pre-dawn operation. GJ-11 struck and destroyed these forces, as the rocket strikes from this gunship here had struck this small group of Marines, of U.S. Marines patrolling this swampy area. They were all annihilated by rocket strikes and 23 millimeter AP HE ammunition. It wiped them out. At the opening of the battle, at the opening of this very map, artillery was also playing a key role in the operation, as this blast icon for an artillery shell strike indicated several shells from the same howitzer hitting this area, as there was a fire at will command given until it was told to stop. At 4, these shell strikes have wiped out a handful of militia personnel that were immediately around the strike zone of these shells, and would be followed up by further strikes, as these imminent artillery strike icons indicate, and many personnel would be wiped out in these southern portions of the map, including a squad-sized element of militia who tried to flee across this tributary by getting onto one of its islands, which was wooded and in part, and trying to get to the other side where the former fortifications had earlier been destroyed, as this indication here is of a destroyed tunnel network from the tunnel and fighting position network that was to the southwest of the main base camp. And as it was destroyed by the earlier J-10 strikes from the J-10 fighter aircraft, the fighting in this area involved a lot of artillery strikes, as this particular foxhole would be hit heavily by artillery, causing personnel to flee into the tunnels as the bombardment hit this general area, only to repopulate it every so often to continue to maintain observance over this particular area to ensure that this sector would not come under attack to where they couldn't try to defend against it. And in this area, mortars, 82 millimeter mortar strikes, and artillery were also coming in hard as this group was trying to flee early in the operation into these two foxholes to get into the tunnel networks to relative safety, but they were pounded heavily by 122 millimeter shell strikes, including the personnel manning this particular foxhole, which consisted of about 5 U.S. Marines. They were hit by 82 millimeter mortar strikes, as this mortar strike icon indicates, and also by artillery strikes along with these groups trying to flee to the safety. This group fled into the tunnels as the strikes had been coming in, this group of militia manning this particular position. This grouping of militia was destroyed by mortar and artillery shell fire. This group trying to flee out of the area completely in south were pounded by artillery and thoroughly annihilated. This group, too, fleeing through this thickly wooded terrain, as this was all woods here, they were trying to flee into the tunnel system, but were destroyed by the artillery firepower, as these personnel were destroyed by a direct shell strike, ISR-directed, AI battlefield data processing system directed right into this foxhole before they could even get into the tunnels for having relative safety against such attacks, as the shelling was a relative surprise early on. And as a result of all of this fighting that was going on in this area, these platoons would hold their positions in these drainage systems before advancing between 4 and 5 a.m., as they would not move again until 5 a.m., as the intelligence about this particular area and the planning for this operation involved extreme caution. While the tempo was still relatively high for the PLAN Marines, caution was advised because it was assumed, and assumed correctly, that the forces in this particular area did have some potent heavy weapons, which was actually true, and had already been demonstrated by the 2 U.S. Marines getting in a surprise attack against one of the Z-18 utility helicopters, causing 2 entire squads of PLAN Marine casualties, KIAs, and the co-pilot and pilot, which was 22 KIAs off the bat, which would ultimately be a contributing factor to why the KIA count would be higher than the WIA count in this battle, as well as also the Claymore mines being used to great effect. The improvised device would never get to be used, as it was seen and destroyed by 23mm fire from this gunship before the troops began to advance into the area here. As that was going on between 4 and 5 in this area, these gunships again were destroying groupings of personnel like this Joint Marine and Militia Patrol that had been hit with rocket fire, as the rocket strike icon indicates, including this trench, or this foxhole here, being completely destroyed by 70mm rocket fires, wiping out this whole group of militia that were currently populating it, but it would attempt to be repopulated later by other militia groups moving throughout the area in these tunnel networks. This would be 5 Marines taking position with their 50 cal machine gun coming out of the tunnel network and taking up fighting positions to fire up in the air with their M2 50 cal and their small arms fire at the attacking attack helo gunships, the Z9WAs, who bobbed and weaved to great effect and avoided most of the heavy fire that was being vectored at them. Like the other militia groups, some of these militiamen had civilian market acquired Barrett 50 cal sniper rifles, which they utilized to relatively good effect in this operation, and they, in lieu of not having M250 cals in every foxhole, would utilize in other foxholes these Barrett 50 cals among the militia personnel holding them. As 23mm fire came into this foxhole here, ATGM fire would also be vectored at it and destroy these personnel, wiping out the personnel completely in this foxhole, with the 2 HJ-08s being fired at it, other 2 being fired at this group trying to flee into the foxhole. They were hit by ATGM strikes from this gunship and 23mm fires, as the red around the cyan-colored arrow indicates they were all wiped out. This grouping was pounded with 2 HJ-08 strikes completely into and destroying those occupying this particular foxhole. Although this foxhole would be repopulated by these personnel moving in, a combo of Marines and militiamen, while there were other militiamen trying to flee out of this particular area at this time, as it was now 5 a.m. after many groups had already been wiped out in heavy combat from these gunships. Just before the stroke of 5, at approximately 4:50, this gunship, having had already pounded this area, wiping many personnel out and destroying these forces here with rocket strikes, these Marines patrolling the swampy areas, as they bobbed and weaved and tried to exchange fire with the remaining survivors holding this foxhole and others that were moving in to repopulate it, as indicated by these arrows that show them leaving and coming back in to avoid some of the heavier fire. They would return fire with their M250 cal and effectively spray the general area within which the helo was flying. And as the helo was bobbing and weaving, many of the shots missed, but there were a few lucky shots that shredded into the helo, causing it to have to evacuate and limp back to the Type 075 helicopter landing dock or amphibious assault ship, the flagship of the 6th PLAN Marine Brigade as a whole, from which these helos were based, and have to have major repairs done to it, effectively taking it out of the fight from the Combat Aviation Company. Therefore, although they had a Z-18 as a total loss from their transport aviation company, their loss of a Z-9WA attack helo gunship, although not a total loss, would effectively take one of the 10 out of operations in terms of the upcoming continued search and destroy missions that were being planned for the rest of the day. Although this would leave a combat aviation company still highly combat effective, it was definitely a sign to the leadership of the 6th PLAN Marine Brigade that even more stringent measures of caution had to be taken for further operations. Although, again, the fact of the matter was the heavy weapons were the main contributor of the success. It would have been far harder for a militiaman with a 50 cal Barrett sniper rifle to pull off such a feat, as this had a far higher rate of firing the same ammunition type as did the single shot Barrett 50 cal sniper rifle. As the gunship was taken out of commission and limping back and getting out of the area to go back to the Type 075 helicopter landing dock, this gunship would take its place immediately after first having had engaged forces over here, hitting this foxhole, wiping out all of these militiamen in it with rocket fire and 23mm fire. This gunship hit these personnel, wiping them out with rocket and 23mm fire, and then shifted positions, and then shifted again as they were being engaged by personnel that repopulated this foxhole after they were first wiped out by this gunship. These gunships would continue to maintain the pressure on these foxholes, as these gunships had already wiped out substantial groups of personnel both in foxholes and outside of them. This gunship hitting this group with an ATGM and another ATGM in the front, and 2 ATGMs hitting the Marines manning this foxhole, and would end up destroying their M250 cal, taking it out of commission, blasting it with their ATGM strikes and 23mm fires. 2 follow-up shots of ATGMs would be fired at personnel trying to hide in the woods, taking position to ambush the soon-to-arrive PLAN Marines, as by 5 a.m., the sea-based cruise missile strikes came in and destroyed this entire area, which is why it's encompassed in red, but would also be encompassed in blue overall as well, because this whole area, in an arc of munitions, approximately in a diamond shape, as 4 of the Su-34s are flying in a diamond formation, would drop their munitions to where it would pound this whole area with air-to-ground munitions, as the Su-34 strike aircraft would each jettison their entire payload of 26,000 pounds of air-to-ground munitions per aircraft, which was simply gargantuan in terms of air-to-ground payload, and these munitions would smash and blast the swamps and woodlands to splintery, stumpy pieces, leaving almost nothing left, and would completely destroy the tunnels and foxhole networks as a whole as well, much like the earlier J-10 strikes did in the north and the southwest, as the J-10s, although they carried fewer munitions, dropped almost the same amount of tonnage of munitions as did the Su-34s, as the combined 8 total J-10s would drop 96,000 pounds of air-to-ground munitions, while the 4 Su-34 strike aircraft would drop 104,000 pounds, which was still more than the J-10s, as they carried more than twice the payload, and it would only take half the aircraft with the Su-34s as opposed to the J-10s. Both aircraft simply slammed this area with munitions, as the rocket-assisted projectiles pounded positions in the south, as these two YJ-18B sub-launch cruise missiles came in from the one-class sub that launched them and destroyed this whole area, including its entire foxhole and the surrounding entry points with these tunnel systems. These personnel were thoroughly wiped out at the time. As this occurred at 5, by then, these forces were making their moves toward their objectives. This squad, while en route to clear this shed, while one squad bounded to clear this house, while the squad in the middle, holding positions on the other side of the road, would be, according to building clearance procedures, moving in a staggered column formation to watch either side of either of these homes in order to send a half squad into either building if there were troubles inside, as they had taken fire from both buildings, while this squad cleared the house here, and this squad cleared the house here, and again, this squad was moving to clear the shed. The squad moving to clear the shed would be almost completely annihilated by the setting off of the Claymore mines again, which again alerted these forces that were now at 5 moving in the north here to clear these buildings and move through these areas here to watch out for these tunnel entrances. Because again, although the ISR apparatus could see virtually all movement occurring on the ground, these areas were massively well camouflaged to the point where it was difficult to see very tiny, minute details like claymore mines being planted in the area, even by the advanced technologies being employed, as they were well camouflaged and disguised by the Americans, the defenders, as the U.S. Marines utilized their field craft, along with many of the militiamen that had prior service experience, to enable the planting of many of these weapon systems with great efficiency and efficacy and effectiveness overall, as only the IED was seen here along the lane and destroyed by this line of trees and hidden in the grasses. As it was discovered and suspected of being such, it was wiped out by 23 millimeter fire, which ended up saving personnel from these squads as they would move through these areas, as this pipe-based munition was facing 2 different directions and could have been quite hazardous and causing WIAs to this squad here or this squad over here as they advanced. As this squad had moved by and the claymore mines triggered as they faced this way and this way, hitting the entire squad, basically causing 7 KIAs and 3 severely WIAs. The medevac was called in immediately from the flying platoon of 5 Z-18s that had been responsible for dropping off first logistics and then also conducting medevacs into the operation. One flew over here immediately, dropping off its combat medics, who began to pull out the WIAs and KIAs from this now downed squad. A whole squad basically almost eliminated. While that had occurred, and this squad had cleared this house and then moved in to clear the shed and briefly exchanged fire out of the shed with these Marines running to the safety of their tunnel network into this way, which was guarded by an IED. They fired out at each other as these personnel ran in, and then they were called to conduct a rescue attempt. And as they moved through the area, they had taken some fire from personnel over in this particular foxhole, which wasn't at the time destroyed, even though this area was by the cruise missile strikes. They were fired at through this thickly wooded terrain, as fire in general was just being exchanged into this area. They fired back, and made it to this shed safely, and then came around to pull guard duty against this entrance, which they were now well aware of, as the quadcopter assets again had been running circuits through the area. And when these personnel were hit by the mines, obviously it was seen, and of course now it was made aware that this area was one of the entry and exit points. As also, when these personnel, these 8, had escaped into the area, they had not been seen running further over ground, so it was already assumed that there was some kind of entry point, but it was not known that they were defended by mines. And now that this happened with the Claymore mines, now it was known that this entry point was most likely defended by Claymore mines or probably an improvised device. The same could be said for this tunnel system, which was defended by the pipe-based improvised device. And therefore, as the squad moved and briefly exchanged fire as they moved in a staggered column formation out of this building, watching both sides, they fired into the woods where they were taking fire. Again, the distances between this foxhole and this group here were relatively sizable. Again, this was a 2-mile east-west by 1.5 mile north-south area on this map. Therefore, the fire was basically poorly aimed and just most of it smacked into trees, but the few rounds that zinged over the heads of these troops caused them to return fire, which was also ISR directed through their Combat Data Link real-time AI battlefield data processing system, guiding them on their angle and traversal fire at these personnel, as again the quadcopters were running circuits all over the place and could see all of the enemy movement in these foxholes and now moving through the woods. As that occurred now, the squad pulling security again exchanged fire with these personnel, these 8 militiamen and 2 Marines in this area, and cut down a few of these militiamen that popped their heads up and were cut down in the exchange of fire. As this was going on, the medics from the landing Z-18 were now coming in and pulling personnel out gradually and putting them in the helo to effectively fly them all out in the medevac flight. As that was going on, this squad would remain in its position to guard the entry point to this tunnel system to cut off any means of escape, while this squad moved up as these buildings were being cleared, and the last personnel, the 8 and the 3 survivors in this building, were cut down by the stack teams moving through and clearing these buildings out. As that would now lead to the next phase, as by 6 a.m., after these operations had gone on, both in the north on the ranch, as these forces now were firing at the entry point here, and this platoon, now moving around as a flanking force, was heading towards the rice farm and overall the remaining trench systems in general, as an airstrike had been called in with all of the above ground movement and movement in these foxhole scenes that were also being heavily suppressed by fire from the gunships, gradually causing attrition against the American militiamen that dared to come back and repopulate these sites after being wiped out by the gunship fire. The Su-34 strike was now coming in at 6 a.m., or 2 hours now into the fighting, as the firefights had gone on for approximately an hour in other areas. The Su-34s came in and pounded much of the base camp and its underground areas to complete and total oblivion, with 104,000 pounds of air-to-ground munitions, just wiping out this entire area in a diamond shape as these aircraft had come in. Also, these personnel that had made attempts to flee through the forest to get away, as they likely suspected such was about to happen, as they had already known about the airstrikes to the north and to the southwest. They were now trying to escape through the area, and by the time they were in these positions, they were wiped out by all of the munitions, including these Marines that were in the woods here trying to assist in the attempted ambush against the PLA Marines should they come through the rice paddies, the rice farm, as they had their different fighting positions set up again for interlocking fields of fire for mutual support throughout this area to support one another with interlocking fields of fire to create kill boxes in different areas of their battle space and so on. And the rice farm was one of them, as this plan would be horribly shattered by this incoming airstrike, as again, PLAN Marines were trying to use caution as they moved through the area. One platoon would be the flanking force to help carry out a perfect L vector of fire that would be backed up not just by the 82 millimeter mortar strikes from the extended range mortar ammunition, such as in this animation or illustration, where plant matter and shrapnel and water and soil is being blown in multiple directions from the mortar impacts, also from the 23 millimeter cannon fire from the gunships, which is the HE armor piercing ammunition, blasting personnel into pieces as weapons were thrown in all directions and some halfway underwater, and personnel and their body parts being thrown in many directions. The loitering munition strikes coming from the CH-901A loitering munitions with their fragmentation warheads would also be contributing to the devastation against the American ground forces in this area, as some were fighting from the woods, others from the rice paddy, as again they had tried to conceal themselves in the rice paddy and were seen and pounded by 82 millimeter mortar fires and mortar strikes and 23 millimeter cannon fires. They would be completely and absolutely wiped out by the firepower that would be deployed against them by the 6th PLAN Marine Brigade's air assault forces. As 10 personnel were in this barn as these squads moved into place after the buildings had been cleared, and one squad blocked the entry and exit point to the tunnel network. The Su-34 strike had come in and wiped out all of these tunnel networks, as all of this surrounded in blue means that all of it was destroyed in the airstrikes. As again, it came in as a diamond pattern in this area, wiping out everything in this area, leaving very little left, which included just barely these positions here, which were already shattered by all of the gunship fires, as well as this position. The same could be said from HJ-08 strikes and 23 millimeter steady fires, and also this area destroyed, and even these Marines that were to take part in trying to ambush these personnel on the rice paddy, rice farm, they were wiped out in the airstrike too. These personnel were just far enough away to where they weren't destroyed by the airstrikes, although these tunnels collapsed and wiped these personnel out, as all of this was destroyed right here. These personnel were just barely out of range and had not been completely wiped out in those strikes. However, as this platoon had now moved around to outflank these forces, they took position along this bog and in this thickly wooded swampy area along this bog here, and started to fire through the fence line into the rice paddies from their wooded positions, as these two squads of this platoon bounded and covered tactically over top of the tunnel system. As they were not fully aware they were all over the tunnel system, they bounded and covered tactically towards this position here, which had already been hit by a number of gunship strikes from HJ-08 ATGMs to 23 millimeter fires. Now they were laying down heavy fire as these two squads bounded and covered to suppress this position, which had been repopulated by militiamen who were now firing at the positions here. As these two squads cleared this metal building, they entered the shattered barn, now having had been destroyed by heavy 23 millimeter fire from gunships over in this direction, and gunships here vectoring fire against this building, destroying it with 82 millimeter mortar strikes. They completely smashed it to rubbled ruins with all the twisted metal and equipment inside. And these two squads had taken up fighting positions therein and were now attacking the personnel out in the rice paddy. As they were taking positions in these buildings, they laid down heavy fire at the American positions in the rice paddy, along with the personnel who were taking up position in the thickly wooded terrain around the rice paddy, and were also likewise laying down heavy fire with their Type 69 rocket-propelled grenades, their standard small arms, or QBZ-95 rifles, their light machine gun fire from their QBJ-201s, and 35 millimeter tube-fired grenades, and even hand grenades, as they were somewhat within hand grenade range to get some of the enemy personnel, and of course loitering munition, mortar, and gunship fires hitting this area, wiping out many of these personnel. As there were dozens of militiamen in the rice paddies and in the nearby woods combined, and a few Marines, they would all be struck near this entry point here. As some of them tried to flee, these Marines would try to flee after setting off claymore mines, as this squad would intend to bound and cover towards these personnel after these threats on the flanks were wiped out by the CH-901A loitering munition strikes, as these loitering munitions were fired by each platoon of each company that had been sitting back and defending positions along the landing zones, and essentially each one equipped with a fragmentation warhead would slam into defenders along with mortar fire into these rice paddy positions, while the flanking platoon came in and laid down heavy fire along with the 3 squads of this platoon, as they had lost one of their 5 squads earlier by the claymore mines, the other squad pulling security in this area. So 3 squads in this shattered barn and in the farmhouse were laying down heavy fire against the personnel in this area, while the flanking force came around and also laid down heavy fire while suppressing this position being repopulated by militiamen with heavy gunship support into the rice paddies and the surrounding forest and the loitering munition support. The fighting was absolutely devastating in this particular area, and casualties were high among the defenders. As the last 30 minutes of the fighting between 6 and 6:30 a.m. would occur in the battle overall in this particular area here in the rice paddy, it would be a 30-minute long battle over the rice paddy. And the rest of the 30-minute last 30 minutes of the rest of this battle essentially would see the sweeping of the area destroyed in the recent Su-34 strikes and a battle damage assessment being carried out to ensure that all defending American forces have been thoroughly annihilated at this point. But for now, the rice paddy was the last position of contention in this particular operation, where the 2 sides were slugging it out against one another, as the Americans had defensively planned to turn this rice farm into a kill box of sorts due to the massive firepower advantage of the PLAN Marines, as well as the coalition more broadly, as the air power was decisive in this operation, as well as the gunship support, mortars, artillery, even the sea-based cruise missile strikes. The Americans could do very little to defeat the PLAN Marines as a whole from these quasi-elite air assault infantry formations, as these 2 companies were very professional, very well trained, and highly capable forces. And now, as they eliminated the American threat in the rice paddies and the rice farm, the Americans were gradually bit by bit being cut down. As they tried to shift position to face the flanking force, they were cut down in a hail of small arms and gunship and mortar fires, as well as also loitering munition strikes, as the 4 deployed single-tube versions of the CH-901As flew in and pounded American forces both in the rice paddies and around them in the surrounding woods, such as in this animation or illustration. Off in the distance, militiamen and Marines are taking position in the woods and trying to fight back. Squad-level quadcopter asset is trying to monitor the defenders off in the distance to help with the squad leader giving directions to his troops in which areas to fire and the angle and traverse of their weapons, including this soldier firing a 35mm tube-fired grenade from under his QBZ-95 rifle. Hand grenade being thrown from off of this animation or illustration into the rice paddy. Mortars are landing. Loitering munition strikes are inbound, and gunship fires coming in and blowing defenders to pieces. As the flanking force would also be decisive in this operation, at least from the ground level, as they came around and got to within grenade range of the remaining foxhole position, they would toss hand grenades and spray the area with small arms fire to eliminate the militiamen that would repopulate this position after the Marines had already been wiped out by earlier gunship fires from HJ-08s, as well as also destroying their M250 cal that had once occupied this position with the missile fires, with these last two missiles being missiles fired at these personnel moving to face these squads of this platoon. These three would remain along the bog, these other two bounded and covered to clear this foxhole position, while the other forces in the rice paddy, although they briefly shifted positions to exchange fire with those in the farmhouse and in this position here, were wiped out again by drones and all the other weapon systems, as these two Marines had the command det cord for these two claymore mines in the rice paddy. Essentially, half a squad would bound in through this choke point, as these were well camouflaged, by the way, as they were right on the edges of the rice paddy and positioned well hidden in mud, making them difficult in terms of an IR signature to see effectively. The det cord had been triggered by the last surviving Marine, as the gunship fires, mortar strikes, and drone strikes were coming in and hitting these personnel, as well as small arms fire. The last surviving Marine triggering these command det claymore mines had wiped out the entire half squad, all 5 troops, as the half squad effectively was essentially a stack team formation, or a half squad of 5 troops. The entire 5 troops, as they would proceed down this causeway between the rice paddies, were completely and totally annihilated. No survivors from the claymore mine attack. And as a result, they too would be medevaced, but as KIAs among the KIA count. There would be several other KIAs in this battle as well, besides the 7 in the south from the claymore attack, the 5 in the rice paddy battle from that claymore attack, and the 22 total that perished on the Z-18 utility helicopter. There'd be a total of 39 KIAs, or essentially what amounts to four full squads, but 2 squads per company. And each company would lose the equivalent of 2 squads, roughly. There would be 22 WIAs, with most being very light and able to be patched up and returned to duty, as the only WIAs that would be severe would be a small handful, such as the 3 survivors from the claymore attack from the 10-man squad in the south. And there would be a severe WIA from these 2 punji pits that were dug in this area, as the platoon that was now clearing this area from the flanks, helping these 3 squads in these positions here, 1 in the farmhouse on the rice farm and 2 in the rubbled barn that had been hit by mortar and 23 millimeter fires. The L vector of fire had assisted in wiping these personnel out with gunship fire, mortars, loitering munitions, and effectively after this platoon would reform after the battle and all the fighting had died down, would sweep the area. And as they swept the area, 2 squads would sweep to the north and 3 would sweep to the south after combat had ended. They would do a BDA of the massive airstrike and cruise missile strikes and artillery strikes that had in the south basically wiped out virtually the entirety of this base camp, with very few exceptions, such as this foxhole, which was stormed by these 2 squads first before the battle ended, and the entryways to these tunnels, both in the south and the north, where the militiamen and the few surviving Marines would eventually run out of ammo and surrender. While some had been killed during the firefight, there would still be a few survivors who would end up being POWs. There'd be 2 surviving Marines in the north, the same 2 that fired their their Javelin ATGMs to destroy the Z-18 with its personnel on board that remained on board. And there would be a Marine survivor in the south and 4 of the 8 that had fled into this tunnel system who were fighting from it against the squad, as they were hit heavily by the weapons that equipped the ground-based troops as they continually laid down heavy fire against the tunnel entry points. But The reason why other weapons were not deployed into these areas was due to the proximity of the PLAN Marines against the Americans, and they did not, according to the real-time AI battlefield data processing system calculations, want to cause any friendly fire incidences with their own Marines, with their own troops, as the ground troops were more than enough to handle the situation as it were. They eventually attrited the Americans in terms of gradually not just wiping out the American defenders, but also causing them to run out of ammunition, and they were forced to surrender. As there was one surrendering Marine survivor in the southern group in this tunnel, they would tell the squad, as they all came out and surrendered to the squad, they would tell the squad that the airstrikes had isolated the command bunker, as they had not heard from the command for 30 minutes, as again, the last 30 minutes of the fighting occurred in the rice farm area. As they had not heard from the command elements for 30 minutes, as these firefights here and here were still going on bit by bit, as they would pop out, fire, hide, pop out, fire, hide, and they would return fire continually in both the north and also in this area. The area that was completely smashed, the only surviving part of the tunnel system was this one bunker, which was the command bunker of the combined Joint Militia and Marine Command. There were 5 Marines that were the highest ranking among the 50 surviving escaping Marines. And then there was the militia command element that was already familiar with their own people, as they already had organized their own militia and they established their own command elements as they were quasi-organized. They were working together in this deep 20-foot underground bunker, which was just deep enough to survive the airstrikes, as these tunnels were not. And the tunnels went down deep, 20 feet deep into this bunker. The upper parts of the tunnels were now all cut off from the bunker, and they were now buried alive. And they were going to run out of oxygen had it not been for the prisoners of war captured, among them this one Marine mentioning that they had a command bunker, and the PLAN Marines mercifully exhumed the bunker, digging down to get to these personnel, and effectively took them as prisoners of war, as they had no chance of resisting. They were completely trapped in here, and they had to be dug out. So they had to throw down their arms and basically surrender, or else the Marines could have rolled in a few hand grenades and wiped them all out, as they were trapped in this facility. So they willingly surrendered, and there would be a small haul of prisoners of war out of this group in this particular battle space, as the battle was now won. And again, the flanking platoon at the rice farm battle was now doing these sweeps and battle damage assessments over the areas destroyed by the Su-34 airstrikes. They would soon depart the area and return to the Type 75 helicopter landing dock to prepare for their next operations, as although the losses were the heaviest suffered by any PLAN 6th Brigade unit of the Marine 6th Brigade between these two companies of the Air Assault Battalion, they would be reused in the next operation that was to occur 7 hours later, after a rest period and a massive maintenance operation to get all their helicopters prepared, both their gunships of their combat aviation company that were remaining, not the one that had been taken out of commission for some time, as it required far more extensive repairs, and also the remaining Z-18 utility helicopters, as they had originally 15 but were now down to 14, which wasn't a huge loss and effectively would still suffice for the further operations. And the troops themselves would get a rest period for 7 hours to prepare for their next missions, as the next operation would see them going into similar terrain as the large battlefield they were brought into for this operation, although the next battlefield would be in a slightly smaller area and would also be prepared with preliminary airstrikes from the available coalition air power in the Beaumont Port Arthur battle space, as the next battle would see a slightly smaller militia group of local militiamen, numbering approximately 450, being heavily depleted by airstrikes, along with thousands of non-combatants, just as what had occurred in this area, as there were non-combatants throughout this 2-mile by 1.5 mile map, as they had pitched tents in the area, or either that, or were moving through the area, traversing the area to move on to other areas at the time of this battle. And the massive air assault attack with the massive airstrikes that had led up to it and during this operation, as well as missile and artillery and other strikes, had caused thousands of non-combatant/refugees to be completely and totally annihilated during the course of this operation, as nearly the entire 500-man strong militia force would be completely wiped out, with a very small number of POWs taken, and the U.S. Marines would almost be entirely destroyed, again, with a tiny handful being taken prisoner. Approximately 4 were taken alive out of the group of 50. Although, again, they would give the PLAN Marines, as it could be said, a run for their money, as the PLAN Marines had suffered their heaviest casualties up to this point in the Beaumont/Port Arthur battle space, and this would remain the heaviest casualties suffered by them throughout the rest of the battle, as the battles to follow would be nowhere near as intense in terms of the resistance offered up by the defenders as this battle had been. As the rice farm had been shredded to absolute pieces by the plethora of different munitions deployed against the forces holding it, as the platoon of PLAN Marines who had outflanked the American defenders, who themselves had thought that they were going to put up an effective sort of ambush in this operation, which only slightly succeeded with the wiping out of an entire half squad with claymore mines. One of the 2 squads holding this position would pull out the KIAs and bring them back to the LZ for their transport back to the Type 75 helicopter landing dock so that they could be dealt with by the mortuary forces of the Service Support Company of the 6th PLAN Marine Brigade, as the medics had also done the same in the south with this squad, saving who they could save of the 3 survivors, but pulling out the KIAs to this temporary LZ for one of the 5 Z-18s responsible from one of the 3 flying platoons for the logistics and medevac, taking them back as fast as possible. This platoon, the flanking platoon here, would reform again and move through the swampy area, and the 3 squads moving south would clear the area to the south, ensure all of these personnel were deceased, wiped out, and these personnel, this large grouping of several dozen that had fled this area trying to flee south, had only made it here to the tributary here and to here by the time of the airstrike. They were all wiped out, along with all personnel still hiding in tunnels and in the fighting positions when the airstrike came in, so they were all wiped out, and this would be seen by these 3 squads, but one member of one squad would step in a punji pit that had been prepared earlier, as they would step onto it and fall right in, and the stake would drive right through their foot and into their lower leg, horribly damaging the muscle and Achilles tendon, taking one soldier completely out of the fight. It would be a horrible, painful, agonizing, suffering attack from this PLAN Marine, as the punji pit was a nasty trap to fall into. Therefore, the soldiers would prod the areas ahead of them lightly with their bayonets attached to their QBZ-95 rifles to ensure that they did not step in any more punji pits. Although there were only 2 dug outside of this tunnel system, and the Americans knew where they were, when this group early on in the operation was trying to flee, they knew to go around these punji pits to get to their particular foxhole they were trying to get to in order to get to their underground tunnels for safety. As this battle was very reminiscent of Vietnam War era operations in terms of search and destroy operations, the PLAN Marines of the 2 air assault infantry companies, again, now prepared to withdraw after conducting their BDA over the area, and now pulled back to their original LZs in the wheat fields, in the two wheat farms, and now awaited the arrival of their Z-18 utility helicopters from the two flying platoons that had dropped them off and now are coming to pick them up. Even with one less Z-18, because of the earlier medevacs of a substantial number of troops, there was room with the original two flying platoons, which now numbered 9 helos, Z-18s instead of 10, to pick up both companies and bring them back to the Typo 75 vessel, their flagship of the 6th PLAN Marine Brigade, to prepare for further operations. By 2 p.m. in the afternoon, as the entire battle had wrapped up by 7 a.m., as the final sweep had been done by then, and they had pulled out of there as this had concluded by 7:30 minutes after the fighting in the rice paddy ended. They now pulled back and flew back to their Typo 75 out past the Sabine Lake and prepared for their next operation, which would be the assault against this 450-man strong militia group directly north of Beaumont. And then they would have one final operation in the nighttime hours of the second day, just before day 2 had officially ended. As for the grouping to be assaulted in mid-afternoon, they would be hit heavily by coalition air power, as both the J-10 fighter aircraft, conducting another RTB and returning, this time equipped with napalm canisters in addition to thousands of pounds of air-to-ground HE ordnance, or standard munitions, would also be joined by carrying out strikes with the Su-34 strike aircraft of the Su-34 squadron, also returning from their RTB back into the battle space by the time of late afternoon on October the 5th, or day 2 of the nationwide invasion. These final massive aerial operations would see the complete and thorough destruction of the vast majority of the remaining militiamen on the ground, who were still trying to hold out and carry out resistance operations against the invasion forces, who were soon to turn occupiers and colonists. As the last of the U.S. Marines in the area were now completely and thoroughly wiped out, with a tiny handful being taken as EPWs, enemy prisoners of war, or POWs, prisoners of war, they would now be brought back to the Port Arthur Municipal Airport, where there was already a POW camp established since earlier on day 1, which was defended by elements of the Shorad Battalion, who, lacking air targets, was carrying out a range of other operations, such as convoy escorts for the support battalion, as the support battalion was the whole brigade's chief logistical force, as the support battalion were they who operated the logistical facilities on Port Arthur, and they ran the supplies to the forward combat units, such as the Heavy Combined Arms Battalion's Headquarters and Support Company, receiving logistical shipments from the Support Battalion, or the Combat Engineer Company, the Recon Company, the Medium Combined Arms Battalion, or the Recon Battalion, Medium Combined Arms Battalion, and Light Combined Arms Battalion, all received logistical shipments from the Support Battalion, and the Shorad Battalion again pulled security for these logistical shipments deep into the battle space. The only battalion that did not receive logistical support from the Support Battalion was the Air Assault Battalion, as they had their own logistical system from their own supply vessel and the Typo 75, as they flew their own supplies out to their own forward deployed troops by helicopter. In the next video installation of this hypothetical invasion documentary series, highlighting 4th generation warfare doctrines through the lens of a Sino-Russian coalition invasion. The battle in the north central portion of the Beaumont-Port Arthur battle space to eliminate the remaining militia forces present will be covered in the next video installation, as the roughly 450 strong militia group in the north central portion of the battle space was essentially the largest and last remaining sizable force attempting to put up any sort of resistance against the invasion turned occupation forces of the 6th PLAN Marine Brigade. As powerful coalition airstrikes would shape this battlefield, much as they did the battlefield in the northwest of the battle space, many of the armed reactionary civilian militia forces would be smashed in the airstrikes alone, with the rest being rapidly mopped up by the air assault operations into this particular area of operation. More to come in the next video.